Her hands are steady, but her breath catches. The door in front of her wasn't supposed to open for another 50 years. Behind her, footsteps. Someone's coming. Someone who'll ask questions she can't answer. It's March 2020. The Vatican has just opened one of its most controversial collections. Documents from the pontificate of Pope Pius X, the wartime pope accused of silence during the Holocaust. 53 miles of shelving, 15,000 files, letters, telegrams, diplomatic cables. Some researchers have waited their entire careers for this moment. But there's a problem. Researchers report gaps in the record, unexplained absences in specific folders where documents should be, files that reference other materials that can't be located. She knows because she helped catalogue them. She knows because she was told not to ask why. The footsteps are getting closer. What you're allowed to see tells you what they want you to know. What you can't see hints at what they fear. Beneath Vatican City, deep below the tourist crowds and the Sistine Chapel selfies, lies one of the most restricted repositories of information in the world. 53 miles of shelving, approximately 85 kilometers, 12 centuries of papal correspondence, 35,000 volumes in the selective catalogue alone, letters from kings begging for annulments, trial transcripts from the Inquisition, secret diplomatic negotiations, evidence of scandals covered up, treasures hidden, crimes documented. For 400 years it was called the Archivum Secretum Vaticanum, the Vatican Secret Archive. On October 22, 2019, Pope Francis issued a motu proprio ordering the name changed to the Vatican Apostolic Archive, a public relations move, the Vatican claimed. Secret doesn't mean hidden, they insisted. It means private, the Pope's private archive. But if it's just a name, why change it after 4 centuries? And if there's nothing to hide, why are most documents still locked away? Why does it take 6 months of applications to get access? Why can researchers only view 3 folders per day? Why are some periods still completely sealed? The doors are opening, slowly, selectively, and never without reason. What follows isn't myth or hearsay. It's what the Vatican has confirmed, what historians have uncovered, and what remains sealed behind the world's most guarded walls. This isn't a story about conspiracy theories or wild speculation. This is about real documents, real restrictions, and real questions that the Vatican still won't answer, about what we've discovered when the doors finally opened, and about what's still locked away, gathering dust, waiting for a future generation brave enough to look. What follows is an examination of documented evidence and competing interpretations. Where historians disagree, we present both sides. Where evidence is disputed, we say so. The Vatican's story is complex, neither conspiracy nor innocence, but something far more human. Before we step through those doors, do one thing for me. Hit the like button so this story doesn't get buried as deep as the archives themselves. Subscribe, because what's coming next isn't rumor. It's written, filed, and waiting to be found. Picture yourself as a historian. You've spent years researching medieval papal politics. You need to see a specific letter from Pope Innocent III, dated 1209, regarding the Albigensian Crusade. You know it exists. It's referenced in other documents. But you can't just show up and ask to see it. First, you need institutional backing, a university, a research institute, a government. Individual hobbyists need not apply. Then you submit a formal request explaining exactly what you're researching and why. The Vatican evaluates whether your request is serious and scholarly. If approved, and many aren't, you receive a limited access card valid for specific dates. You arrive at the entrance on Via di Porta Angelica. Armed Swiss guards check your credentials. You pass through metal detectors. Your bags are searched. No ink pens allowed. No photography, Cameras and phone cameras are strictly prohibited. You can bring a laptop, but no internet connection is allowed inside. You're given pencils, only pencils. You enter a reading room that feels like a monastery library, crossed with a high-security facility. Silence is absolute. Daily capacity is capped at 60 researchers. Researchers whisper like they're in a cathedral, because in a way, they are. This isn't just an archive. It's a shrine to institutional memory, to control, to the power of information. You submit a request form listing the specific documents you want to see. Up to 3 archival units can be requested by noon each day. Not 3 boxes over your entire visit. 3 units per ordering window. You wait, sometimes hours. Sometimes they tell you the document is not available. Sometimes they bring you something that's been so heavily redacted, it's useless. When the documents arrive, you can't photograph them. You can't scan them. You can transcribe them by hand or type them on your disconnected laptop. Every page is numbered. Every movement is watched. Touch the document wrong. Use the wrong kind of pressure. Turn a page too quickly, and archivists will remove it immediately. You might lose access for days. At the end of the day, you leave. Your notes stay with you, but the knowledge that you've only scratched the surface haunts you. 53 miles of shelving, 85 kilometers of history, 35,000 volumes in the selective catalogue alone, millions of documents. One researcher calculated that if you requested 3 archival units per ordering window, 5 days a week, 52 weeks a year, with no holidays or breaks, it would take centuries to see everything that's currently available for viewing. And that's just what's available. The Vatican's usual practice is to keep documents sealed for approximately 70 to 75 years after a pontificate ends, though popes can grant exceptions. Materials from 1939 onwards, everything from World War II to the present, remain mostly sealed under this practice. Pope Pius XII died in 1958. His archives only opened in 2020. Pope John Paul II died in 2005. His complete archives will remain closed for decades under usual practice. Knowledge controlled is power maintained. Information released is power shared. Slowly. But why the restrictions? What's the Vatican protecting? Are they hiding scandals, covering up crimes, protecting reputations? Or is there a more mundane explanation? Bureaucracy, preservation concerns, institutional inertia? The answer is yes, to all of it. Let's talk about what we actually know is inside. Because the truth is dramatic enough without conspiracy theories. The Vatican Archive contains some of the most historically significant documents in Western civilization. 3 examples stand out. The trial records of Galileo Galilei, 1633. You can see where his hand trembled. The scientist who dared to say the Earth revolves around the sun. The Vatican called it heresy. Galileo's own handwriting, forced under threat. I abjure, curse, and detest the errors and heresies. The ink pressure changes where his resolve wavered. The Church didn't officially pardon Galileo until 1992, 359 years later. The letter from King Henry VIII of England, 1530. His royal seal pressed into red wax, still intact after 5 centuries. Desperate, pleading, demanding the Pope annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon so he could marry Anne Boleyn. The Pope refused. Henry broke with Rome, created the Church of England, and changed European history forever. One man's desire to remarry fractured Christianity. The papal bull excommunicating Martin Luther, 1521. Deset Romanum Pontificem. It is fitting for the Roman pontiff. The title itself drips with papal authority. Luther had nailed his 95 theses to a church door in Wittenberg, challenging the sale of indulgences and church corruption. The Pope's response was excommunication. Luther's response was the Protestant Reformation. The document that triggered it all sits in climate-controlled storage. And there's more. Letters from Michelangelo complaining about delayed payments, about Pope Julius II's impossible demands, about the physical toll of painting the Sistine Chapel ceiling, documents from the Inquisition, thousands of trial records spanning 700 years, accusations, torture protocols, execution orders. These files only began opening to scholars in 1998. History is written by survivors. Archives are maintained by institutions that survived by controlling the narrative. But there's something else in those files, something the Vatican doesn't advertise. Evidence that the Inquisition was sometimes less brutal than secular courts. Records showing that accused heretics occasionally received fairer trials in church courts than in royal ones. Documentation of inquisitors who refused to execute people despite political pressure. This doesn't excuse the horror, but it complicates it. And that's what archives do. They complicate simple narratives. They force us to see historical figures as complex, contradictory, human, which raises the question, if the Vatican is willing to open these controversial files eventually, what's still locked away? What's so damaging that even centuries of distance isn't enough protection? What they show you is calculated. What they hide is revelatory. March 2nd, 2020. After decades of pressure from historians, Holocaust survivors, and Jewish organizations, Pope Francis finally orders the opening of the Pius XII archives. Pope Pius XII, who reigned from 1939 to 1958. The wartime pope. The pope accused of remaining silent while 6 million Jews were murdered. The debate has raged for decades. Was Pius XII a coward who chose institutional preservation over moral courage? Or was he a strategic diplomat who saved lives through quiet negotiation rather than public condemnation? Did the Vatican help smuggle Nazis to South America after the war? Or did they shelter Jews and refugees? The archives promised answers. Researchers flooded Rome. Applications overwhelmed the system. Then COVID-19 hit. The archive closed. When it finally reopened, scholars began the painstaking work of reading through millions of pages. What they found wasn't simple. It never is. A letter dated December 14, 1942, revealed that Pius XII received detailed reports about mass gassings of Jews and Poles. The information was specific, credible, and came from reliable sources. The Pope knew. Earlier than previously documented. More detail than he ever publicly acknowledged. But also evidence of secret efforts. Research documented that convents and monasteries in Rome sheltered more than 3,000 Jews during German occupation. Coded messages to bishops instructing them to provide sanctuary. Diplomatic pressure on governments to stop deportations. Vatican properties used as refuges. Priests and nuns who risked their lives, often at great personal cost. The picture that emerged was neither hero nor villain, but something more troubling. A calculating diplomat who weighed every word, every action, every public statement against its potential consequences. Pius XII believed that public condemnation of Nazi atrocities would make things worse, that it would endanger Catholics in Germany, that it would prompt even more brutal retaliation. Was he right? We'll never know. We can't rerun history and see what would have happened if he'd spoken out forcefully. What we do know is that Anne Frank, writing in her diary from her Amsterdam hiding place, wished the Pope would say something. She died in Bergen-Belsen, waiting for words that never came. Silence in the face of evil isn't neutrality. It's a choice with consequences written in blood. But here's what troubled researchers most. Not just what the archives revealed, but what they didn't. Gaps in the record. Missing documents from crucial periods. Correspondence that should exist but doesn't. Files that appear to have been culled before being released. Vatican officials insisted this was normal archival practice. Not everything is preserved. Documents get lost. Some materials were destroyed during the war. All plausible. All convenient. One historian, working through the daily logs of papal correspondence, found something odd. The log listed a meeting in 1942 between Pius XII and German diplomats. Topic: Jewish question. Duration: 45 minutes. But the actual notes from that meeting, not in the expected location, not filed elsewhere in any discoverable way. The gap remains unexplained. Maybe it was lost. Maybe it was destroyed in 1944 when parts of Rome were bombed. Maybe an archivist misfiled it in the 1950s and it's sitting in the wrong box somewhere in those 85 kilometers of shelving. Or maybe someone removed it deliberately, because what was said in that meeting couldn't be allowed to survive. The absence of evidence isn't always evidence of absence. Sometimes it's evidence of careful curation. Friday, October 13th, 1307. Dawn breaks across France. Simultaneously, in cities and villages across the kingdom, soldiers move. They arrest knights, men who had been warrior monks, protectors of pilgrims, bankers to kings, the Knights Templar. The charges are spectacular: heresy, devil worship, spitting on the cross, denying Christ, obscene rituals, idol worship of a mysterious head called Baphomet. The accusations sound like fever dreams, like propaganda designed to destroy an organization that had become too powerful, too wealthy, too independent. King Philip IV of France ordered the arrests. He owed the Templars massive debts. He needed their wealth. And Pope Clement V, politically weak and dependent on French support, went along with it. Trials followed. Torture extracted confessions. In 1312, Pope Clement dissolved the order. By 1314, the last Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, was burned at the stake in Paris, reportedly cursing both king and pope as the flames consumed him. For centuries, this was the story. Political persecution disguised as religious prosecution. The Templars were innocent victims of royal greed and papal weakness. End of story. Except in 2001, a researcher named Barbara Frail was working in the Vatican Archive when she found something. A document that had been misfiled, overlooked, gathering dust for 700 years. The Chinon parchment. It was the record of a secret papal investigation from 1308. Pope Clement had sent Cardinal Berenger Frédol to interrogate the Templar leaders privately, away from French political pressure. The interrogation took place in the castle of Chinon, and the findings were explosive. The Templars admitted to some of the charges, not devil worship, not heresy, but they confessed to a secret initiation ritual that involved symbolic spitting on the cross, not as blasphemy, but as a test of loyalty, simulating capture by Muslims to prepare knights for the possibility of forced apostasy under torture. They confirmed they had developed unorthodox religious practices during their time in the Holy Land. Based on this testimony, Cardinal Friedel's report records that the Pope granted the Templar leaders absolution and reconciliation with the Church. The document is dated August 1308. It's signed by the Cardinal. It's authentic. The Vatican published a limited edition facsimile in 2007, acknowledging its authenticity. But here's the problem. Pope Clement never made this absolution public. He dissolved the order anyway. He let the trials continue. He allowed Jacques de Molay to be executed as a heretic, even though the Pope's own investigation had cleared him. Why? Political pressure from King Philip, fear of French military power, weakness, calculation, self-preservation. Take your pick. The result was the same: an entire order destroyed, its members tortured and executed, based on charges that the Pope privately knew were exaggerated or false. The Chinon parchment sat in the Vatican Archive for 7 centuries. When Barbara Frail published her findings, the Vatican confirmed its authenticity. In 2007, they released a limited edition publication of the document. The Vatican's official statement was carefully worded. The publication was meant to clear the Templars' name and acknowledge historical injustice. But they couldn't quite bring themselves to say what the document proved: that a medieval pope had knowingly allowed innocent men to be executed for political convenience. Right by the rules, deadly by reality, the Templar story raises uncomfortable questions about what else might be buried in those archives. What other injustices are documented? What other cover-ups are preserved in ink and parchment? And why does it take random discoveries, misfiled documents found by chance, to bring these truths to light? The Vatican's response is always the same. The archives are vast. Cataloguing is ongoing. New discoveries happen regularly. All true. But it doesn't explain why certain types of documents consistently surface by accident, while others remain suspiciously unavailable. Accidental discovery is sometimes the only discovery an institution permits. It's 1945. World War II ends. The Nazi regime collapses. Allied forces begin the hunt for war criminals. Many are captured. Many commit suicide. But thousands disappear. They flee through escape routes that become known as Ratlines. Secret paths from Europe to South America, the Middle East, anywhere beyond Allied justice. One of the most notorious escapees, Adolf Eichmann, architect of the Holocaust's logistics. He disappeared from Europe and resurfaced in Argentina in 1950, living under a false name. He wasn't captured until 1960, when Israeli agents kidnapped him from Buenos Aires. Another, Josef Mengele, the Angel of Death from Auschwitz. He fled to South America and lived openly in Argentina and Paraguay for years before disappearing into Brazil. He died in 1979, never having faced trial. Klaus Barbie, the Butcher of Lyon, escaped to Bolivia, worked with the government, lived freely until 1983. Franz Stangl, commandant of Treblinka death camp, fled to Brazil in 1951, lived there until 1967. The question that's haunted historians for decades: who helped them? These weren't sophisticated international criminals. They were fleeing with false papers, limited resources, hunted by multiple governments. Someone provided safe houses. Someone created false identities. Someone arranged transport. Someone paid for tickets and bribes. Evidence conclusively documents that some Catholic clergy were involved. Croatian priest Krunoslav Draganovic ran a documented ratline operation from Rome, helping Ustasha, war criminals, and others escape to South America. Individual priests and bishops in Italy and Austria who sympathized with fascism or who believed in offering Christian mercy even to mass murderers provided assistance. But the deeper question, whether the Vatican itself, the institutional church at the highest levels, systematically orchestrated these escape routes, remains contested among historians. Some evidence suggests Vatican officials knew of or tolerated elements of these networks. But claims of a coordinated, institution-wide Vatican program remain debated rather than definitively proven. The Vatican's position has been firm. No institutional involvement at the highest levels. Individual priests may have acted independently, against church policy. The Vatican helped refugees of all kinds after the war, and false identities sometimes slipped through screening. But no systematic, Vatican-directed effort to help Nazis escape. Then documents started emerging. Letters showing that some Vatican officials in Rome were aware of Draganovic's activities. Records of meetings between Vatican diplomats and individuals later identified as wanted war criminals. travel documents issued through Vatican channels to people traveling under obviously false names. In 2020, researchers working in the newly opened Pius XII archives found more. Communications between Vatican officials discussing the rehabilitation of certain Germans and Austrians who needed to start new lives away from what the documents termed unjust persecution. The language is coded, but the timing is revealing, 1946 to 1951, the exact period when Ratlines were most active. One researcher found a memo from 1947 discussing whether the Vatican should cooperate with Allied war crimes investigators. The recommendation: minimal cooperation. Provide information only when directly asked and when refusal would be diplomatically problematic. Otherwise, maintain discretion. The justification in the memo was explicit. Many Germans and Austrians were being subjected to victor's justice, convicted based on association rather than proven crimes. The Church had a duty to prevent injustice, even if it meant being uncooperative with Allied authorities. This is where moral clarity dissolves into fog. Was the Vatican protecting genuine innocents caught up in overzealous prosecution? Or were they using that justification to shield war criminals? The memos don't fully clarify. The documents raise questions they don't definitively answer. Mercy without discernment protects both the innocent and the guilty. Institutions choose which truth to emphasize. Vatican officials, when pressed about these findings, point out that the Church also helped thousands of Jewish refugees escape Nazi persecution. Vatican properties sheltered Jews during the war. Priests risked their lives providing false papers and hiding places. This is documented and undeniable. Both things can be true. The same institution, the same officials, the same networks that saved Jews during the war may have helped some Nazis escape after it. Motivations weren't pure or evil. They were complicated, contradictory, human. But this complexity doesn't satisfy, because the question isn't whether some priests did good things. It's whether the institution, at its highest levels, systematically aided perpetrators of genocide to escape justice. And the archives, even partially opened, still don't give a complete answer, because the most sensitive documents, the ones that would definitively answer these questions, remain sealed. Files from the Vatican's Secretariat of State during the immediate post-war period are still restricted under usual practice. Personal correspondence between Pope Pius XII and key diplomatic figures won't be fully available for decades. And when researchers request specific documents by name, documents they know exist because they're referenced in other files, they're often told the material is not available for consultation or is undergoing restoration. The most damning evidence is often the evidence you're not allowed to see. We need to talk about the elephant in the archive, the crisis that nearly destroyed the Catholic Church's moral credibility in the 21st century. The systematic sexual abuse of children by clergy, and more importantly, the institutional cover-up that allowed it to continue for decades. This isn't ancient history. This is recent. This involves people still alive, victims still suffering, perpetrators still protected, and documents that the Vatican fought desperately to keep secret. The pattern was consistent across countries and decades. A priest would be accused of abusing a child. Church officials would investigate quietly. If the accusations seemed credible, they would transfer the priest to a different parish, often without warning the new community. The priest would abuse again. More transfers, more victims. When civil authorities got involved, church lawyers would fight to keep documents sealed, citing religious privilege and institutional confidentiality. The scandal exploded publicly in Boston in 2002, when journalists at the Boston Globe uncovered systematic cover-ups by Cardinal Bernard Law. Their investigation revealed that church officials had known about abusive priests for years, had documented the abuse internally, and had simply moved the priests around rather than reporting them to police. The story went global. Tens of thousands of victims came forward. Throughout this crisis, One question persisted. What did Vatican officials know? When did they know it? And what did they do about it? A 1962 Vatican document, Crimen Solicitationis, laid out procedures for handling accusations of clergy sexual misconduct, originally concerning solicitation during confession, but applied more broadly in abuse cases. The procedures emphasized secrecy. Cases were to be handled internally. The document was classified, sent only to bishops, with instructions to keep it secure. When this surfaced in 2003, victims' advocates pointed out that its secrecy policies had continued to influence handling of cases well into the 1990s and 2000s. Then more documents emerged. A 1996 letter is particularly revealing. A bishop writes to Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, then head of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, later Pope Benedict XVI. The bishop describes a priest credibly accused of abusing multiple children. The bishop wants to remove the priest from ministry immediately. Ratzinger's office responds that canonical procedures must be followed first, which could take years. In the meantime, the priest should be transferred and monitored. The priest went on to abuse again. When institutions prioritize their own reputation over the safety of children, every measured word becomes complicit silence. In 2019, Pope Francis convened a summit on clergy sexual abuse. Bishops from around the world gathered at the Vatican. Survivors told their stories. Experts presented data on the scope of the crisis, and Pope Francis promised reform, transparency, accountability. Part of that promised transparency involved opening church archives on abuse cases to researchers and journalists. Create a historical record. Understand how the system failed. Prevent it from happening again. But the actual implementation has been limited. Some dioceses have released files. Some countries have conducted independent investigations with access to church records. But the Vatican's own central archives on abuse cases remain restricted. Researchers who study church history can access medieval Inquisition records more easily than they can access 21st century abuse files. The Vatican's explanation is that these are active cases, ongoing investigations, matters of privacy for victims, all valid concerns. But it also means that the full scope of what Vatican officials knew, when they knew it, and what they did about it, remains partially hidden. And victims notice. They notice that the Church will open archives on Galileo, on the Templars, on medieval heresies, but won't fully open archives on the systematic enabling of child predators. They notice that crimes committed centuries ago get scholarly examination and historical perspective, while crimes committed in living memory are still considered too sensitive. Historical perspective comes easily when all the witnesses are dead. Here's something strange about the Vatican Archive. The restrictions, the limited access, the careful control, all of this creates an aura of mystery. It makes people assume there are massive secrets hidden away. Lost Gospels, proof of aliens, evidence of vast conspiracies. But talk to researchers who have actually worked in the archive, and they'll tell you something surprising. Most of what's inside is mundane. Bureaucratic correspondence, tax records, inventories of church property, endless documentation of petty disputes between bishops, reports on diocesan finances, catalogues of art and relics. The vast majority of those 53 miles of shelving contain the administrative detritus of a 2,000-year-old institution. Because that's what institutions produce. Paperwork. Lots and lots of paperwork. The truly controversial documents, the politically explosive letters, the scandalous revelations, the smoking guns, these are needles in a haystack. And finding them requires knowing they exist, knowing where to look, and having access to the right collections. Which is exactly why the restrictions matter, because they determine who gets to find the needles, who gets to ask the right questions, who gets to look in the right places. When the Vatican opens archives 70 years after a pope's death, they're not protecting state secrets, They're protecting institutional reputation. They're ensuring that by the time controversial documents become available, the people involved are dead. The political situations have changed. The immediate consequences have faded. Its reputation management stretched across generations. Consider Pope John Paul II, beloved by millions, instrumental in the fall of communism, canonized as a saint, but also the Pope during whose reign the clergy sex abuse crisis exploded. The Pope who promoted and protected Cardinal Bernard Law, despite knowing about cover-ups in Boston. The Pope whose officials systematically moved, accused priests rather than removing them. John Paul II died in 2005. Under usual Vatican practice, his complete archives won't be fully available for many decades. By then, everyone who was an adult during his papacy will be elderly or deceased. The victims will be aged or gone. The institutional memory will be filtered through history books rather than lived experience. When those archives finally open, researchers will probably find documents showing that John Paul II and his officials knew more about the abuse crisis than they publicly admitted. They'll find evidence of difficult decisions, tragic mistakes, institutional prioritization. And by then, it will be history, something to study and analyze, rather than something demanding immediate accountability. Justice delayed is justice for the institution, not for the victims. But here's the paradox. The restrictions also preserve evidence. If the Vatican didn't maintain these archives, if they simply destroyed controversial documents, we'd know even less. The fact that the archives exist, even with restricted access, means the truth is being preserved, even if it's not being revealed. Institutions that destroy their records can never be held accountable. Institutions that preserve records but restrict access can be held accountable, eventually. It's a kind of delayed justice, the hope that future generations will judge more fairly, the belief that historical perspective requires distance. Is 70 years enough distance? Should it be 30, 50, 100? Different people will draw different lines, but the underlying principle remains: institutional self-protection through controlled information release. Some things will never come out of the archive, not because they're explicitly forbidden, but because they've been removed, destroyed, lost. Every institution engages in selective preservation. Not everything gets saved. Some things are deemed unimportant. Some things are damaged beyond repair. Some things are accidentally destroyed. And some things are deliberately removed because their existence is too dangerous. We know this happens because sometimes we find evidence of the removal. A letter that references another document that doesn't exist in the files. A catalogue entry for material that can't be located. An index listing a file number that leads nowhere. The most likely candidates for deliberate destruction are documents that could directly contradict official church positions, or that could expose institutional crimes so severe that even centuries of distance wouldn't provide protection. Financial records of church wealth during periods of corruption. Evidence of political murders ordered by popes. Documents proving that certain religious dogmas were established for political rather than theological reasons. Correspondence revealing that popes knew certain miracle claims were fraudulent but promoted them anyway. This isn't conspiracy theory, it's institutional reality. Every powerful organization destroys embarrassing evidence. Governments do it. Corporations do it. The Vatican is no different. The question isn't whether they've destroyed documents, but which documents and how many. The Vatican will never admit to this, of course. Official policy is that all documents are preserved according to standard archival practices, but archival practices include provisions for disposal of redundant materials and deaccessioning of damaged documents. These are legitimate practices. They're also convenient excuses. The perfect crime leaves no evidence. The perfect cover-up removes the evidence systematically enough that its absence seems natural. So, what are we missing? We'll never know with certainty, but we can make educated guesses based on what exists in other archives and what's suspiciously absent from the Vatican's. Complete financial records. The Vatican has been one of the wealthiest institutions in Europe for more than a millennium, yet comprehensive financial records from many periods are incomplete. How much wealth did the medieval church accumulate? How was it acquired? How much came from donations versus confiscations versus selling indulgences versus outright theft? We have fragments, but the complete picture is missing. Political assassinations. Several medieval and Renaissance popes died under suspicious circumstances. Some were openly murdered, others were likely poisoned. Institutional rivals disappeared. Yet documentation of these power struggles is remarkably sparse. Either medieval record-keeping was worse than we think, or later, archivists cleaned house. Forbidden books. The Church maintained an index of forbidden books for 4 centuries. Books Catholics were prohibited from reading under pain of excommunication. Many of these books were confiscated and destroyed, but the Church must have kept copies. How else would they know what was forbidden? Where are those collections now? If they exist, they're not listed in public catalogues. Evidence of heresy trials that reached embarrassing conclusions. We have Galileo's trial because it's famous. We have records of many Inquisition trials. But how many trials ended with the Church being forced to admit the accused was right? How many times did theological investigations reveal problems with Church doctrine? Those records would have been highly problematic. Did they survive? The shape of the gaps tells you what's been removed. The pattern of absence is its own kind of evidence. In 2013, Pope Francis was elected with a mandate for reform. He promised transparency, accountability, cleaning up Vatican finances, addressing the abuse crisis. Part of that promise involved the archives. He ordered the Pius the 12 files opened ahead of schedule. He pushed for greater access to modern records. He renamed the secret archive to the Apostolic Archive. But Pope Francis faces an impossible tension. Every document that reveals past wrongdoing damages the Church's moral authority. Every scandal exposed weakens the institution he leads. Yet refusing to open archives makes the Church look like it's hiding something, which it is. It's the reformer's dilemma. You can't fix problems without admitting they exist. But admitting they exist requires revealing evidence that undermines your institution's credibility. And that credibility is the foundation of your authority to reform. So Francis has moved carefully, opened some archives, enough to appear transparent, keep others sealed, enough to maintain control, release documents gradually, enough to avoid overwhelming scandals all at once. It's damage control disguised as transparency, and it's working, more or less. The Church survived the revelations from the Pius the 12 archives. The information was damaging, but not catastrophic. Critics got ammunition, but the institution endured, which proves, from the Vatican's perspective, that their caution was justified. But it also reveals the game. The Vatican opens archives when they calculate that the damage from revelation is less than the damage from continued secrecy. It's a cost-benefit analysis. When external pressure builds, when historians and journalists are already piecing the story together from other sources, when continued stonewalling becomes untenable, that's when the archives open. This isn't transparency, it's strategic disclosure. Institutions don't reveal truth out of principle. They reveal truth when hiding it becomes more costly than showing it. The question for future popes is whether this strategy remains sustainable. In an age of digital information, leaks, and global media, can the Vatican maintain control over its historical narrative? Or will the combination of internal whistleblowers and external investigators eventually breach the walls? Some researchers are betting on eventual exposure. They've shifted strategy from requesting access to finding leaks. Anonymous sources within the Vatican provide photos of documents. Retired archivists publish memoirs revealing what they saw. Digital copies of restricted materials appear online. Impossible to verify, impossible to fully trust, but tantalizing nonetheless. The Vatican's control over its history is eroding, not quickly, not comprehensively, but gradually, inexorably. And that might be the real story, not what's in the archives, but the slow collapse of the system that kept those archives sealed. Technology is changing everything. Modern papal documents don't exist only on paper anymore. They're stored digitally. Emails, encrypted communications, database records. The Vatican, like every other institution, has moved into the digital age. And digital information is harder to control, easier to copy, easier to leak, harder to destroy completely. When you burn a paper document, it's gone. When you delete a digital file, it might still exist on backup servers, in cloud storage, in email caches. This terrifies traditional Vatican archivists. Their entire system is built on physical control, documents stored in locked rooms, access controlled through human gatekeepers, copying prevented by physical supervision. But digital files don't work that way. Already, leaked Vatican emails have embarrassed the Church. The VatiLeaks scandal in 2012 revealed internal power struggles, financial mismanagement, and corruption allegations. Documents were photographed and leaked to journalists. The Vatican arrested a papal butler for the leak, but the information was already public. More leaks will come. They always do. The question is whether there'll be strategic leaks, information released deliberately by insiders to pressure reforms, or chaotic leaks that expose sensitive information without context. Some observers predict that within a generation, the concept of a secret Vatican archive will become impossible to maintain. That combination of internal reformers, external pressure, and technological change will force comprehensive openness. The archives will become like any other major historical repository, open to qualified researchers with minimal restrictions. Others argue the Vatican will adapt. They'll develop new control systems. Digital documents will be encrypted, compartmentalized, stored on isolated systems. Access will be monitored electronically. Leakers will be identified and punished more effectively. The walls will be digital rather than physical, but they'll still exist. The truth is probably somewhere between. Some secrets will emerge. Others will remain protected. The game of strategic disclosure will continue, just with new tools and new strategies. Every new technology of communication creates new possibilities for both revelation and control. Institutions adapt, but so do those trying to expose them. But there's a deeper question beneath all of this. Should there be secrets at all? Does the Catholic Church, or any religious institution, have the right to hide its history? Does the importance of institutional preservation outweigh the public's right to know? The Vatican's position is clear. Religious institutions need confidential space to operate. Diplomatic communications must be protected. Internal deliberations need to happen without fear of immediate public exposure. Confession requires secrecy. Spiritual counseling requires confidentiality. All true. But these legitimate needs are also convenient cover for hiding institutional failures, protecting criminal behavior, and avoiding accountability. Critics argue that religious institutions claiming moral authority must hold themselves to higher standards of transparency, not lower. That an organization that presumes to guide humanity's spiritual and ethical development shouldn't hide its mistakes behind bureaucratic barriers. It's an argument without easy resolution, because both sides have valid points, and both sides will continue fighting in archives and courtrooms and media for the foreseeable future. We started with an archivist standing before a door that wasn't supposed to open, documents that weren't supposed to be seen, evidence of something hidden. The truth is simpler and more complicated than conspiracy theories imagine. The Vatican Archive doesn't contain proof of aliens, or lost gospels, or secret societies controlling world events. It contains something more mundane and more damning: the documented reality of institutional self-preservation across centuries. Letters showing that popes knew about corruption and did nothing. Records of political calculations that sacrificed individuals for institutional benefit. Evidence that the Church repeatedly chose its reputation over justice, its survival over truth. But also documents showing remarkable acts of courage. Priests who hid Jews during the Holocaust, documented in their own words. Reformers who fought corruption from within, their letters preserved. Theological debates where truth won over politics. Moments where the institution rose above its worst instincts. The archive contains both, because institutions, like people, are capable of both good and evil, often simultaneously, often by the same people making the same decisions for complex, contradictory reasons. What makes the Vatican Archive significant isn't that it contains unique scandals. Every powerful institution has scandals. It's that it's been preserved for so long, that the evidence still exists, that accountability, however delayed, remains possible. In an age when institutions routinely destroy evidence, when digital records can be erased without trace, when lost hard drives and accidentally deleted emails have become standard excuses, the Vatican's preservation of its complete history is almost admirable, even if they won't let us see most of it. Yet, the most powerful institutions are those that control their own history. The most accountable institutions are those that eventually allow others to examine it. The archivist stands before the door. Behind her, footsteps echo closer. She has seconds to decide. Return the file to its shelf, pretend she never saw it, or make a copy. Risk her career, maybe her freedom, for the sake of truth that won't be officially acknowledged for another 50 years. What would you do? What would any of us do, caught between institutional loyalty and historical honesty? That's the real secret of the Vatican Archive. Not what's hidden in the documents, but what's revealed about human nature, about how institutions function, about the eternal tension between power and accountability, between secrecy and truth. 53 miles of shelving, 12 centuries of history, millions of documents, some accessible, most restricted, a few deliberately destroyed. All of it carefully managed to protect an institution's reputation across generations. And somewhere in those miles of silence, among the letters and trials, and diplomatic cables and financial records, lies evidence of crimes covered up, of heroes ignored, of truths too dangerous to reveal and too important to destroy. The archives wait. They're patient. They have time. The question is whether we do, whether justice delayed for 70 years is justice at all, whether transparency postponed indefinitely is anything more than a sophisticated form of censorship. The Vatican knows the answer. They've spent centuries perfecting the art of controlled disclosure. They've learned that time heals institutional wounds, that distance transforms scandal into history, that the dead can't demand accountability. But they've also learned something else. That truth is stubborn. That evidence preserved eventually gets examined. That every generation produces researchers willing to ask uncomfortable questions and journalists willing to publish uncomfortable answers. The walls around the archive are thick. The rules are strict. The restrictions are real. But walls can be breached. Rules can be changed. And restrictions, however carefully maintained, eventually erode. The Vatican's hidden archive isn't hidden because it contains unique treasures or impossible secrets. It's hidden because institutions survive by controlling their narratives. And the most effective control is deciding what people see, when they see it, and how it's presented. In the end, every secret is just information waiting for the right moment to be revealed. And every institution is just a collection of people betting that moment won't come during their lifetime. The footsteps have stopped. Someone is standing outside the door, waiting, watching. The archivist makes her choice. She always does. We all do. And history records it, even when it takes centuries to acknowledge what happened in this room, in this moment. With these documents, that's what archives are. Evidence of choices. Some made in courage, some made in fear. All of them preserved, catalogued, restricted, and waiting. Waiting for the day when someone with access and courage decides that truth matters more than institutional comfort. When the documents speak louder than the rules designed to silence them. That day hasn't come yet, but the archives remember. They always do. And eventually, they tell.